That's fascinating because what I hear as you're describing things, I hear you both in your curriculum, you have an attention to the content of the curriculum, the books, the subjects of knowledge, but there's been a lot of reflection on the approach to the teaching and also just, as you say, the cultivation of habit and virtue and what does that take? And then linking something like craftsmanship. I mean, it's easy to think of craftsmanship building something in a purely utilitarian sense. Like you're teaching somebody a skill. And what I hear you saying is that crafts and technical manual trades, let's say, they can be a skill, but they also develop the person as a person who can pay attention, as a person who has virtue. And so I think of one book I often teach. So on the one hand, I teach the Benedictine tradition, of which manual labor is a really important part. And then I pair that with something more contemporary, Matthew Crawford, The World Inside of Your Head. And he makes the point that, as Jacques Maritain says in Education at a Crossroads, one of the temptations, especially in the United States, is to associate education with intellectualism, with just filling your head with knowledge. But really, the end of knowing something is to be able to live a good life. And so what Crawford says is that intellectualism has led people to think that someone like him, who has a PhD in philosophy from Chicago, is really smart, and somebody who's an auto mechanic, just isn't that smart. Where he actually says doing work with your hands isn't just, it is bringing something into being that wasn't there. You're making an object, but you're actually learning and forming yourself. You're forming the virtue of attention, but you're also, as you said, with all of your examples of going outside, you're looking at how nature actually works and how we interact with nature to build something. And that itself is actually very intellectually taxing work.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, who would you say are some of your philosophers or writers on education that have influenced you? Have you read, for example, Charlotte Mason, or have you? Oh, okay. Can you tell us a little bit about Charlotte Mason and how she's influenced your views of education?
Definitely. So I also, when I moved back to Philly, in addition to being involved at Martin Saints, I taught at a Charlotte Mason homeschool academy. And that was only one day a week, but it was amazing. It was really, really lovely. And so I've been, I guess, for the past 4 years, reading Mason, with a group of women in this area and kind of learning more about her and her work and her educational philosophy. And yeah, I think Charlotte Mason is an incredibly important conversation partner for anyone who's thinking about what is a human person and what does it mean to educate them. She's a woman who just committed her entire life to education. She was orphaned at a fairly young age. I think by the time she was 18, maybe even 16, she was teaching. And as she was teaching, as she was boots on the ground in charge of children, she started taking notes and she started paying attention to what was working and what wasn't working. And she lived, I think, into her 80s. And so just over the course of her life, she taught extensively. She developed a teacher training college called Ambleside. She sort of launched this movement of parents in the country of England who kind of continued her work. So the Parents National Education Union, the PNEU, who continued to write articles and essays. She wrote 6 volumes, and it wasn't just all about in the classroom education. It was about kind of the whole of life. So one of her volumes is all about parents and children. One of them is this cool kind of like guide to your inner self. It's called Ourselves, and it's written both for students and for teachers to almost familiarize themselves with the terrain of being a human person, right? That you have conflicting desires in you, and there's some good and there's some bad, and life is learning how to navigate these parts of yourself in different scenarios. So I think what Charlotte Mason gives us is this really fleshed out philosophy of what does it mean that children are born persons. She has, I think, 20 or so foundational principles. And then it's from those principles that, her methodology flows. And I hear educators talk, I've used this phrase several times already in this presentation, that children are persons and we are persons. And it's like, well, what does that mean? And Charlotte Mason is a practitioner who spent so much time and just gives so many amazing reflections on what it actually means that children are born persons. It means that we can, from a very young age, tell children a story and ask them to tell it back to us in their own words. And this is what narration is. And in the course of narrating this story back to the teacher, they're not just regurgitating the information, they're also processing it. They're also, their mind is kind of feeding on these living ideas in this story, and they're engaging with it. And so, sometimes you get the heavily strict Dorothy Sayers model of classical education, that you've got, the 3 stages: grammar, logic, rhetoric. And since those little kids are just so darn good at memorization, we're just going to make sure they memorize everything when they're really little at that grammar stage. And Charlotte Mason says, yeah, they're good at memorization, but they're also good at marveling at stories. And they're also good at paying attention to butterflies and plants. And we should be doing all of these things as part of our, educating them as persons. I think with the class, I think there are so many wonderful conversation partners in thinking about education and the liberal arts. And we can go back to Plato and Aristotle and St. Benedict and John Henry Newman and G.K. Chesterton and Joseph Pieper and so on and so forth. But I also think that what Charlotte Mason gives us is this kind of body of work that the body of work in the liberal arts tradition is almost so huge that we can have very different schools that pop up in this classical or liberal arts tradition that end up looking very different in terms of the books that they've chosen, and especially the method of education that they follow. Whereas what Mason does is she gives, I think, a much more clear methodology. Whether you disagree with her or not, at least it's clear what it looks like to teach a lesson and to ask the students to do a narration, and how to lead a picture study, having the students look at a piece of art and talk about it, or how to lead nature study or composer study. If you're the kind of person who appreciates the kind of, it's all together and it's all a coherent living method and philosophy, then that's where Charlotte Mason is really helpful. And I think she is part of this movement of people asking, what is a human person and how do we educate them? And so, she's certainly a part of the classical education tradition or the liberal arts education tradition. Though she does have kind of this distinct following of people who are very committed to Charlotte Mason. So.
Well, I'm going to add that to my list of resources to include and to share with people, because this actually has come up in my class this semester, that there's a lot of discussion about discussion and dialogue in the classroom. But I heard you use the word storytelling, and that has now come up with my students, thinking about in what ways does a teacher model and invite students into telling a story. Right. And so I think that some of the examples you gave, that we don't only study nature, we actually think about it in context and tell a story and narrate. So I think that that's a really important way of broadening the discussion around the methods of liberal arts education to storytelling, narration. Absolutely. And it's part of the philosophy of the person that I teach in one of my classes. Human beings are storytellers, right? And in some ways, this is controversial, but in some ways, science itself is a narrative, right? It's seeing things, but not everything about science is visible. Gravity isn't visible, right? Yeah. So, the story of the Grand Canyon, it's based on what we're observing, and it's based on what we're inferring based on what we're observing. And so to think about even science as a narrative. To be a good scientist, you have to be a good storyteller in a way. You also need to know the lab science and the reductionism, but there's such a reductionism in STEM fields that I think that science as story might not, maybe it won't get you a job, but it should. So just, that's a good title for something, science as story.
There you go. Yeah. One of you can take that on as a project someday.
Right. As soon as you see storytelling, people go to the humanities, but thinking about all fields of knowledge are part of a story, I think is what I was getting at. So I'm going to add Charlotte Mason to the list of resources that I recommend people look into. So thank you for that, because you mentioned many of the others that I teach: John Henry Newman, Jack Maritain. We teach Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, John Dewey. And I think, again, what I hope to do, and thank you for joining us today, I hope to expose students to different understandings that complement each other. Sometimes I think they're saying different things, but I think it's important to read the most influential writers who thought philosophically about education and educational methods.